Hello, commentary fans. This is Mike again, and I am here with you for a new episode in our commentary project. I don't know if I have any loyal listeners left or yet, but I promised in the last one that we do something different today, other than the classic monsters, and I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to break that promise because today we are going to do Mark of the Vampire. It's a little bit different. It's a 1935 production from MGM instead of Universal, and it stars our old friend Bela Lugosi, and it is directed by Todd Browning. And we'll see. It's very similar to Dracula, and in a lot of ways, it's actually a superior film. We'll go into that today. I am watching the VHS edition, and I have it paused on our classic MGM line as he's about to roar in this classic horror film. I'm going to start it in 1, 2, 3. We gotta take a minute to warm this up. Here he comes. He's roaring. Right after Dracula, our old friend Todd Browning was given an assignment by Irving Thalberg, the head of production at MGM, the boy genius who really created the horror genre in a lot of ways, as he was involved in the first American horror film, Hunchback of Notre Dame, with Lon Chaney. But Irving Thalberg saw what a huge success that Frankenstein and Dracula were, and he, in addition to discovering Chaney, he also was a very faithful patron of Todd Browning and the films that they made together at MGM. Lon and Todd Browning were the work of Irving Thalberg. He produced them. The most famous and the one that started him off was The Unholy Three. But Browning kind of found himself in a little bit of a rut after 1930. His muse, Lon Chaney, died, and he had to continue with his career. And some would say he went into better waters, but with the film's Dracula. But as we saw last time, Dracula really wasn't a typical Browning film. A lot of people said that it was very much the work of Karl Freund. And he followed up Dracula. Thalberg gave him the assignment to out Dracula, out Frankenstein, Frankenstein. And what he delivered them was a film called Freaks, which I'm sure we'll probably go into in a later episode. But Freaks was virtually career suicide. And Browning found himself pretty much, I don't know what you call it, a neutered filmmaker. He couldn't deliver the kind of films he did before. He always had a censor over his shoulder. And this is where we find Mark of the Vampire. Here is our old friend Michael Visseroff, and he's just as good as ever. In a lot of ways, he's playing the same role. And here, I think he gets his most screen time. Browning awards him with his most screen time. And he's warning our tourists about the vampires that haunt Prague. He still has that huge pipe from Dracula and that big goofy mustache. This is a very similar film to Dracula, and I think we're going to find out that despite a lot of its shortcomings, and this film is pretty I mean, it's very much has some shackles on it, considering the fact that Browning was very much afraid of losing his job, I would say. He knew that he wasn't in any position to fight for his films. But I think this movie is more of a quintessentially a Browning film than Dracula is. This film actually takes place contemporary to where it is, and it still has this old kind of feel to it. They explicitly state that it takes place in 1931. Right now we have a little fella called the town doctor. He's played by Donald Meek. And I think one way that this is very different from Dracula is that Browning puts in a fair amount of comic relief in this film. Dr. Meek being the most blatant example. Here we are introduced to the main plot of the film, and Jean Hersholt as Baron Otto comes down and very cavalierly and pretty unpassionately tells them that their master is dead. Karl Borland. Inspector Newman from Prague is upstairs with the body, and Inspector Newman is played by Lionel Atwill, whom we were already introduced to in Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, and this is one of his first horror films. Although he was a horror icon, I think this is the first time he plays an inspector, and that is probably the role he's best at. He played an inspector later on in The Son of Frankenstein with the wooden crook arm. But Atwill, he's very bold in this movie, and I think he has a lot of sincerity to the parts that he plays. I like him as these authority figures, and I think when we compare this to Dracula and Van Sloan's performance, there's more of a sense of passion in Atwill's delivery, and that he realizes the grave importance of this. And there's some similarities to Dracula in that Atwill is playing the skeptic in this movie. The one that, doesn't believe in vampires at all. Here we are introduced to Elizabeth Allen, who is playing Irina, the female protagonist of the film. And I think she is a stronger character than sometimes we do. I think from a performance standpoint, but not really from a written script standpoint. Elizabeth Allen, she has sort of the same tendencies of weakness that some of these heroes, female characters in the vampire films have, but I think we get more of a sense of where she comes from. She's not helpless just because she's a woman. She's helpless because she kind of has the normal human reaction of being scared. Gene Hersholt, we're going to find more about his character in this film, but he's, I don't know, I think he's a weak link in the film, but I kind of like him in that he's sort of sly, and he's very much a fake, and you'll definitely see later on in the film that it definitely plays in, but I kind of like him in that, he wants especially in that scene with Atwill, that he wants to, present a good face and, be liked by everybody. Right now, we're going to see the very first example of this stupid horror cliche. Browning invented it, unfortunately. The best of horror came from Browning, and now the absolute worst. Here he comes, the little kitty coming out of the knight's armor. Oh boy. Just think 80 years later, they're still pulling that on audiences, and we're still smarter than having to fall for that. Of course, Mark of the Vampire is a remake of the famous lost silent film London After Midnight. And London After Midnight is a vampire film, but it also is a detective film. And it was marketed originally as a Scotland Yard thriller. And in it, Chaney plays the dual role of the vampire and the vampire hunter. And it's very much a film of the 20s, in that, as we spoke before in Dracula, the horror had to be sort of explained away as not belonging to the supernatural. One of the things I like about Mark of the Vampire is that it does come from MGM, and MGM was the grand prestige studio of this time in comparison with Universal, which didn't quite have the same prestige to it, the same kind of weight of the production. MGM boasted the finest actors and the finest production values. Right now, the story has moved about a year forward since the Carol Borland killed himself, Serbato. And here is Irina's boyfriend, Fedor, played by Henry Wadsworth. And, he isn't really a big part of this picture, thank goodness. It's really about the vampire hunters, and they don't bring him in. And, he's not really all that good in the film. I will say he's better than David Manners, but he's not really given a whole lot to do either. And I kind of like the fact that he doesn't really have a whole lot to do in the picture, because it's just, I kind of get tired of the fact of, the romantic hero in these kind of films doing their, going through the motions of trying to win the lady. Instead, we get the more interesting characters, Lionel Atwill, Inspector Newman, and Lionel Barrymore's Professor. Right now, we have the Baron Otto explaining away what has happened in the time, and that the old castle has been completely abandoned. And just the idea, that it's set to rot is kind of like, I don't know, this movie has a lot of conceits, but that might be the most interesting of all of them. Here's the maid character, or at least one of them, and, looking at the stills for London After Midnight, you have to imagine that there was a lot of scenes where she's screaming or being afraid, and it'll play in this film too. Fedor has been attacked by the vampire. one of the things about this movie that that is added to the controversy of the time is that Fader here said that he is attacked by Count Mora, the vampire played by Lugosi, and when Irina is attacked later on, she's attacked by Mora's daughter. Yep, like clockwork, she goes screaming out of the hallway, screaming vampires. Right now, we're about to be introduced to our vampires. Bela Lugosi as Count Mora, and Carol Borland as his daughter, Luna. And Lugosi at this time, this was like kind of really the end of the peak of his American career. Look at all these goodies and bats flying around, and really by this film they had kind of mastered the puppet bat, because that looks semi-presentable, and Browning still hasn't learned his lesson. You see the possums walking around and scurrying about. But Lugosi at this point in his career was kind of at the end of the peak. This came out in 1935, and by 1935, they kind of had enough of horror films. It was harder and harder to get them passed by the censors. This movie in particular had a great deal of trouble. The original runtime was about 80-something minutes, and in order to get it passed and approved, it almost had to have a whole almost 20 minutes taken out of it. I believe the film only runs around an hour, but there was a whole bunch taken out. And a lot of speculation goes into what exactly got taken out. And one of the major points was the relationship between Mora and his daughter Luna. It's been speculated that there was an incestuous plot between them, and that Mora was molesting his daughter, and this big gaping bullet wound from his head was Mora killing himself and coming back as a vampire. Carol Borland, who plays Luna, was an interesting woman. She was a very, a fan favorite of the Monster Kids, and she always spoke very highly of her involvement in the film. I brought this book up quite a few times in the film, in the commentaries. Robert Creamer's The Man Behind the Cape, and she is one of the main contributors to the book. Her eyes are fantastic, and so is that makeup. And here is probably a scene where that lent itself to the controversies of this film. The idea that the woman attacks the woman. And, that was pretty much, it was maybe a little much at the time, and you could definitely see why this film kind of ended horror films for a little bit in terms of it offending people. And the thing that's ironic about that is that Browning was so afraid of that notion. But I think what works about this movie, and why you can definitely say that this, above Dracula is a Browning picture is that Browning had an attraction to the perverse. And he would often say that, you know, that when there's a section of people who want to see, the macabre, that watch the horrible. Browning was in a car crash, and a quote from him that was in David Scowl's book, The Monster Show, that I like a lot, is that he says, there's a certain segment of audiences that get a rush from looking at the wreckage of that kind of stuff. And it's true. It really is true. Here is our star, Lionel Barrymore, as the professor. And, he above anyone else is, I think, why this film is so good. If he were placed in Dracula in the Van Helsing role, that movie would have been tenfold better. Because I think what Barrymore brings to the part is the eccentricity of the vampire hunter. And he does a good job in that he delivers the role very straight. He puts a lot of weight on what he says, but then he walks a fine line, and he's having a really great time doing it. And it's a fun performance. I think that is what I love about it. And I think Barrymore was a good actor to work with Browning. They had worked before this in West of Zanzibar. And they worked after this in a movie called The Devil Doll, which isn't very good, but I think Barrymore has a lot of fun in it, like he has a lot of fun here. But what I really think that Barrymore is in tune with is Browning's fascination with the bizarre, that he really stresses out, the idea that there are such things as vampires, I think what I really like about Barrymore, and I think what he does above any other, person in the role of vampire, is that he stresses out, the idea that maybe this, sort of Van Helsing character actually, wants to face a vampire, that he has this kind of morbid curiosity in seeing something beyond, and that, the idea that a scientist wants to, kind of go beyond science and see something in the kind of the supernatural, the line between science and the supernatural. What I like about Barrymore is that he's very funny too. It's a great multifaceted performance, and these three here, Baron Otto, Professor, and Inspector Newman, they're a very good. They play off each other very well, and that Newman, he's got that Lionel Atwill sternness to him, and he, has the kind of hard-nosed edge about playing the police inspector, and Professor Ziska here has the kind of, the eccentricity that, they go off each other very well. And Baron Otto is just a goofy kind of millionaire who doesn't know what to think. And we'll find out later in the film what's really going on between them and how it plays off of how they play off of each other so well. Batthorn. I think the man, that's really interesting. In London After Midnight, which I of course haven't seen, nobody has in 80 some years, but in that film they had reefs with the swords through them, and in this film they have Batthorn, which I've never heard of that before, but it actually sounds pretty plausible and interesting. One of the things that they did in London After Midnight, and they sort of do here, although Count Mora is his own sort of separate entity from the ghost. But one of the things they do is that, you know, it may be that the father is a ghost. And I think what I really like about this film, and that what you can really see and why I really admire kind of the MGM touch on this movie, is not just the acting, which I think just they get better actors, of course, but the sets as well. Like, Universal didn't really have these sort of grand sets that they did, that they have here. Like just that main house set with that grand sweeping staircase. And then later on, we're gonna see, I think, the finest haunted houses of this area, of this era of film. Here's Lugosi and the double, the ghost of the Baron. Fedor gets kind of a thankless role. He does the same thing that David Manners does. All he sort of does is sort of question the professor and, you know, just get the opposite answer. But what gets it here that's different is that we get the other characters as well. I think one thing about the film that I think is different from London After Midnight is that it was a dual role for Chaney, in that he played the vampire and the professor character that Lionel Barrymore is playing here. And I think if you have seen this, you sort of know, well, you already know where the film is ending up. But I think what is interesting about that idea is kind of the duality of the characters. Mark of the Vampire is a more complicated remake than what the original London After Midnight was. The characters are expanded. In Chaney played the two characters, and in this film it's spread out between Lugosi, Barrymore, and even Atwill, because in the original he was an inspector as well. One thing I think I don't really like about this movie is just the humor. I don't know, it's just kind of goofy. And I think, as we discussed earlier, it's just kind of a marriage to the old ideas of making a horror film. And the problem is that Mark of the Vampire is a 1920s horror film made in the 30s. We're gonna see Count Mora again, and Lugosi has no dialogue in this film until the end, but they really do I think he does a good job in the movie. I think the makeup in this film in particular, and just kind of the atmosphere, the cinematography is spectacular. Like the images are almost as good as what Freud did in Dracula, and like how they're different. Oh, that snarl on Lugosi's face is fantastic there. You know, it's here we have the maid again, and this kind of humor, it's real goofy, and you know, Atwill is really good at kind of playing a keel to it. But as I was saying earlier, um, the makeup on Lugosi and the cinematography is really perfect, and I think in a way it's very different from Dracula in that this is a much faster moving film, and I think it's really interesting in seeing how Lugosi plays off of that, you know? He does really well, and I think would have been even more. Um, oh, you know, I think Lugosi would have been pretty good in the silent version of Dracula. His voice, you know, is such a huge part of it, but he's really good at relaying his face. Carol Borland is Luna in the film, and she she brings a lot to this picture. But as I was saying earlier, as I was saying, Sir Carol, her father. Ooh. Herschel is pretty good in this movie, actually. I kind of like him. The whole movie is all about them trying to frighten him, and he's just. He's really kind of something else. You know, I kind of like his fakeness and just kind of how scared he gets here. But, going off what I said earlier about Cara Borland, she was a young actress who became a huge fan of Lugosi. She saw him in the West Coast production of Dracula while she was an acting student, and she really sort of fell in love with him, you know, as a fan, and she met him after the show and they exchanged notes, and what she really wanted to do was, you know, be in that production. I think for a while she did portray the role of Lucy in a version of Dracula, in a production of it. But what she did was she wrote a screenplay for a picture called Countess Dracula, and she showed it to Lugosi, and he fell in love with it and actually tried to get it produced. And I guess they lost touch for a little bit, but she came in to audition for the role of the vampire Luna here, and when she came in to play off of Lugosi, here's probably one of the most iconic shots of this movie. She has Luna flying in, and just this haunted house set is spectacular. It's, you know, kind of, I think why this film is so effective is in some ways it's not really what the movie shows. It's kind of um, good at implying things, you know, just that bullet wound by itself, isn't really all that shocking on Moira's head. But, just the way you think about it just becomes more horrible. And there's some great images in this film, that's for sure. But, Borland kind of became the go-to interview for Lugosi. And what happened was I think she actually did lie a little bit about her friendship with Lugosi. She went on to claim that the two were lovers for a little bit, and she claimed that she was at his funeral, and then they can kind of prove that that didn't happen. So you don't really know the full extent of things, but she's very good in this film, and you just look at her and you see the DNA for the female vampire. It hadn't really been done all that successfully before this. We see the archetype for them, and just that makeup, that kind of became, and the mannerisms of her performance, the way she sort of has that hypersexuality about the part, and the kind of the idea that the female vampire, isn't kind of a slave, but that she likes, being a vampire, is kind of the way that the part has been based ever since. One of the things I think that Dracula doesn't have, and Mark of the Vampire does, is that there's a cause and effect kind of thing with the plot. Like in Dracula, it's really just Van Helsing, kind of just explaining the same things over and over again in different ways, and maybe a little more stress in some ways. But in this movie, they actually sort of give it some stakes, I think, and just Barrymore explains that if they don't save her now, that she's going to become increasingly under her power. This movie has a pretty decent score. I really like this kind of howl in the wind, and it's kind of fun. Barrymore, I think what he does kind of good here too is that he's really good at sort of playing the part. You'll see later on in the movie. I think it kind of becomes clear, and I think Barrymore makes some very conscious decisions in what he's doing here. You'll see later on in the movie kind of the grand total of things and what the movie leads up to, but I think you'll see that Barrymore has some fun with the role, and I don't know if it's conscious or not, because there are different stories about how the movie dealt with its conclusion, but I like to think sometimes that Barrymore was kind of in on the ending, because I think he has a sort of wink in the way he delivers some of that lines, and I think that's a very good scene there. just one thing about this movie. Um, I think one thing that could have been done a little different about this movie is that this haunted house set is pretty good. But what I was saying was, I think one thing that could have been done is that I think some of the pieces could have been simplified. I think one thing that um, the movie suffers from is that Lugosi's character doesn't get quite the amount of screen time that he should get, but I think he's pretty good in what he does. Just, sort of, I think he makes the most of things, and I think Barrymore here is giving the kind of what I was saying earlier about, the stakes of the film. He's very good at realizing that, kind of giving that film that edge, the idea that this has to be solved. I love the way he has these little nuances in his performance, the way he has his little bifocals there. This is when the movie gets, I think, like as I was saying, about the stakes, I think this is where I think it gets real strong, especially from Hirschalt's performance here as Otto. He gets real scared. You sort of see the pinnacle of where this could go, and just as I was saying earlier, the horrific imagery of the film and why this movie became kind of controversial in that there's a scene coming up where as they're invading the castle here, where Hirschalt's character wants to decapitate a vampire, and that's pretty bold. This is a bold movie, even despite all the editing of it. And this haunted house set is pretty spectacular. We'll see the grand extent of it, but MGM really went all out. I love the door to get in, just like kind of the chain police and stuff. And one thing that is really interesting is the animals that are in here, that they actually went and exported real bats from South America. And these are huge bats. It's really, really cool. Here's the first kind of hint that something's off with things. You see him, Sir Boratin kind of wink his eye there, the corpse of him. And that's something you didn't see in Dracula were rats. The big legend was that the reason they had aardvarks and possums and potato bugs instead of rats, there's a crab. You didn't see that. That's weird for sure. But the reason why they didn't have rats in the film was the idea that they were afraid that they'd spread disease. And here we get the real McCoy, and that's definitely fun to see. Ooh. Here we find Boratin's vampiric corpse. And this was kind of the last hurrah for the classic Age of Horror. And here we have Otto going to decapitate the vampire. This was the last hurrah for classic horror. Around this time was the time when Universal did The Black Cat and the Raven, and they just kind of pushed the edge again and again, and around this time was when um, the British government just outright banned horror films, and this was the end for Lugosi, and Lugosi doing the really kind of classy horror films. After this, he was kind of regulated to just kind of B horror films that were just goofy, and he didn't work for 2 years after this one. But I think this is a real classy performance he gives, and he really makes the most of it, and it's just a really well-made movie, and it's just a gorgeous looking movie too. Here's Luna again. One thing that I think you'll see about the movie later is that, you know, just the female roles in these movies, you just kind of wish that there was more to them. And I think one of the things that you're sort of gravitated almost to Luna over Irina, in that she is the kind of the female character with more power in this movie. And that's really kind of odd, I think. And it might be why this movie is filled with contradictions. Elizabeth Allen's eyes there are really good too. That's really kind of creepy. Here she does the classic sort of scene where the vampire victims kind of plays it straight and try to trick the love interest into thinking that everything is alright. But I think, like I was saying, is that one thing I think is interesting about this movie and why people gravitate towards Cara Borland's performance is that Luna has more freedom here and more of an ability to express herself and have power over her elements than here. And if this movie were a traditional vampire movie, I think it would be sort of disappointing. But disappointing in terms of what it does with the female character, but we'll see later on what's really up. Elizabeth Allen has some really decent eyes for these kind of parts. Those eyes are incredible. Of course, the film is about to lead up to a classic ending. And the ending is really what this movie is about, and how we have to dissect this film. And here it is. One of the things that is interesting about this movie, and I think we'll see it. We'll see it. We'll see it as it comes up. But one of the things about the movie is that Browning, I think, was afraid of the film, or afraid of just kind of the repercussions he would have. And I think the reason London After Midnight was remade was because it offered the kind of horror film that would be safe, I think. But just kind of despite his reservations, we find out that this movie still has a lot to be afraid of. or still has a lot to deliver on the horrors. That's probably one of the big images that scared everyone, or that kind of caused controversy, was her Luna scrolling over here. What we're about to see is that the entire vampire business was nothing more than a giant charade, and that the entire um, thing was actually a ruse to frighten Baronato into realizing that he must confess to the murder of his friend Sir Boreton. And, just looking at this right now, today, it's disappointing. I think people didn't expect it. And I think, just the audiences at the time, maybe this would have flown a little bit better in 1931 or 1930 had it been made right away in the sound era. But instead, they waited, and, people had seen Dracula and Frankenstein, and it just, they were already desensitized to the idea of the dead coming back from their graves. And the actors, supposedly Browning had filmed the entire thing up until this point, and he gave the actors the script, which revealed that the whole thing was a ruse. And I guess all the actors were completely disappointed and kind of like disillusioned with the whole project. Lugosi in particular, I guess, was furious about it. He thought it was the stupidest idea ever. And, I don't know how true that is. I think it might be an urban legend, because how could they really, do a whole thing without giving anyone any sort of idea? And, I'm sure London After Midnight might have been popular enough to give people some indication that, hey, we might be telling the same story, because in London After Midnight, this ending happened as well. But, the whole idea of them reenacting the crime. And, just one thing about this ending, I think in some ways the film earned it, but I think what the movie could have done differently that would have made people, I think, accept the ending a little bit better, was that there's this sense of mystery the whole movie. The film does a really good job at, creating the mysterious sense of surrounding. And then here, everything sort of feels a little bit artificial, You sort of see the strings being pulled, and I think that is what disappoints people most about the ending. Why couldn't Browning have, continued to sort of create that mysteriousness here? Like, why not? I mean, the idea is that Baronato is being hypnotized. Why couldn't, I always think of hypnosis as sort of being, I don't know, magical is the word, but, just kind of being dreamlike, that, he's living in a living dream. Why couldn't this part be told from Sir Otto's point of view, you know? I think that would have made the film a whole lot stronger. But still, that being said, the movie, only is this ending isn't completely uninteresting. I think it's kind of neat seeing the guy here, seeing Boratin kind of go through the motions, you know, play act the character, and I like seeing Inspector Newman and the professor, you know, sort of talk about how this scheme comes together as they watch it. And I think one thing which is very memorable about the ending is is the idea that they blame it on vampires. How did they get the vampires from this, you know? In the original London After Midnight, they don't even do that. They don't. There's not even a conscious effort by Baron Otto to you know, or the Baron Otto equivalent in London After Midnight to frame it on vampires as there is here. I think that is actually maybe a little improvement over the original film. Is that, you know, these vampires don't exactly come out of nowhere. I think you know, like I said, I don't claim to have seen London After Midnight, but you know, it's kind of a movie I you know, have a fascination with. I definitely I've read the script and I've seen all the images, and I think, you know, the movie must have the ending must have been improved here, in that in London After Midnight, in that Lon Chaney played both the professor and the vampire, and I think there would have been a great shock in seeing uh, seeing the vampire to be revealed as a hero. And that's one problem with this ending, is that, you know, even though this is sort of a Scotland Yard thriller in the same way that London After Midnight claimed to be, it's kind of, there's too many people here at the ending working on this case, and I think, you know, one of the things that London After Midnight uh, did a little stronger was that it was more of a private confrontation between this character and the Chaney character, and I think the Marceline Day character who played the Arena in the original could have been stronger. I think she could have been stronger in that, you know, it was up to her to face the vampire, and, you know, she didn't have the help of all these people here. This is goofy logic here. He's trying to create the suction, and I've never heard of anything like this. He heats the glass so that over the, you know, over the prick, so it'll suck the blood out. I've never heard of anything like that, and it's just real kind of goofy. Um, Going off of the idea that this movie's ending was kind of controversial, uh, Carol Borland, I guess, wanted or proposed this idea that, you know, maybe we could still kind of salvage the supernatural elements of this movie. And if we could write an ending off where they could say, you know, the actors didn't come, like the idea was going to be that this telegraph came and said, oh, the vampire actors, sorry we couldn't make it. And the idea was that Count Mora was real and that they kind of played along with this charade. But Browning wouldn't hear of it. He was afraid. I have to think that Barrymore must have known, because there's a little bit of a difference in his performance here when he speaks to Sir Baronato as he arrests him here. I think it'd be interesting to find out if he had known about this ending, because he's a little bit more extreme in the way that he deals with the character ahead of this. You know, he just kind of here is a little more down to earth. And here's Lugosi's one line in the film. He plays this kind of goofy actor here who wants to, have fun as the vampire and be a little prima donna. Maybe he had fun there, I don't know. He certainly wanted to do comedy. And now the film is coming to an end. It's a good movie. I think it has some really haunting imagery. Just like, the shots of Lugosi in his vampire garb, and Carol Borland creating the first femme fatale vampire. It definitely has an ending which disappoints people. I don't think the movie is without its charm, though, and I don't think that ending ruins the movie. I think at its high moments, it does what Dracula set out to do better than Dracula actually did it. It's got a great cast. Lionel Barrymore, he takes that role of the Van Helsing professor-like character and he runs home with it. He really does a good job in giving that sense of urgency, that sense of knowledge, and even that sort of sense of perverted joy in fighting a vampire. And although Lugosi, doesn't have any dialogue until the end, he's really good at having that same haunting effect, even without dialogue. And I think this movie is more indicative of Browning finally getting to do a vampire film. Even though he's the credited director of Dracula, I think this movie is more of a Browning film because it sort of has that perverted quality to it. It has, that sense of humor to it, and the more of a sense of urgency, and more of he gets more out of his performers, and there's that mad energy that Browning was famous for in Freaks and the Unknown is in here, rather than it was in Dracula. I promise that next time I'll look at something a little different, but I really wanted to do a commentary on Mark of the Vampire today. I think it's a great film, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much, and have a good evening, monster fans.